There's no surprise today that when we look at the geopolitical change, and from China all the way to the US, it's no surprise that we can use the word complication. And given the fact that today, when we talk about this political change or the political uncertainty, naturally we have to think about this economic intricacy as well. And of course, in the year of 2024, we continue to pay attention to the wars and also to the conflicts. Needless to say that we're very concerned about what we call political polarization. And too often, we tend to underestimate how much the country can be shifted based on political polarization. Well, at this moment, and you might get tired of listening to the comments and also listening to the news regarding what's happening in the US. Again, this country is going to ultimately elect a brand new president, and we don't know whether it's going to be Kamala Harris or the former US President Donald J. Trump. But meanwhile, let's shift our gear to another critical country in Europe, which is Germany. Now, for so long that when we talk about Germany, we tend to link to the historical documents or even to what's happening within the country. For example, the culture change and also the politics. But recently, a brand new article came out that actually drew our attention. I want to talk about what's happening today in Germany when we talk about this elections and also within this political agenda. How should we understand the voters? And why do you think at this moment that some believe that if anyone would like to make Germany great again, and that is almost a difficult task? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Peter Kuras. Peter Kuras is a writer and a translator based in Berlin. He has written about German politics and the culture for The Economist and the Times Literary Supplement and The Guardian. Well, Peter, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, Peter, such a pleasure to have the conversation with you. Again, as we mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because of this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled, "This is Germany, the last country anyone wants to make great again." Now, let's get to the questions right away. Within the article that you mentioned, and I quote, "Since it became clear that the far-right alternative for Germany, also known as AFD, will emerge as a dominant force in Eastern Germany's politics after regional election this September." Now, let's talk about the far-right alternative for Germany. How should we understand the influence at this moment, and why do you think it's so critical that we need to understand the presence of the political intricacy in Germany today?
I think there's a certain irony when you talk about the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, as they're called. On the one hand, they're increasingly a very strong party. I think the strongest party probably in most of East Germany, and they're gaining strength throughout the West. So while, the election results were very bad, or, in the sense, very, very bad for people who aren't the AfD, very good for the AfD recently, they could have been much worse. We don't, it doesn't look likely that we'll see an AfD government in the East so far this year. So that's very good. But at the same time that they're very strong electorally and they have some real strengths in terms of, parts of their party organization and all of that, they're an extremely weak party in the sense that they have no actual real alternatives for Germany. They have no alternatives in the sense of, an economic policy that is notably different and, offers a real change in approaches to other parties. They have no no policies about, climate or transportation or healthcare or, any of the other things that sort of like make our lives together work or not work, as the case might be, and that you might think of as like really the task of politics. They're extraordinarily weak in all of those regards. They don't have a lot of ideas about how to govern. And I think that is a very common, as much as the AfD is specific to Germany in a lot of ways, I think the problem of having parties gain power who have a lot of ideas about, how culture works and about how race works and about how politics work and all of those things, but don't actually have a lot of ideas about, what it means to live together, or, how we should regulate, businesses and food and, life and all of that beyond, we like people who look a certain way. and we don't like people who look different than that. That I think is an extraordinarily common occurrence throughout the world right now.
Peter, I want to go back to the article. Again, this is something also you mentioned. It's rather critical for our viewers to understand. You wrote, then I quote, "The AFD relies on a toxic combination of xenophobia, militarism, and nostalgia to win votes. But this is Germany, the last country anyone wants to make great again." I mean, again, we understand that when it comes to political parties, of course, there is or there has to be a political agenda. But in actuality, that what voters want or what the voices among the voters matters the most. But right now, again, you wrote that AFD relies on a toxic combination of xenophobia, militarism, and nostalgia to win votes. How should we understand the meaning behind that? I mean, again, it's a political party. How would you run in the platforms? And also the voters are not, I have to say that they're not silly, and they are very much understanding that if the AFD relies on xenophobia, militarism, and nostalgia to win votes, that's not going anywhere. So how do we understand the complication of this whole dependency or this toxic combination that you mentioned in the article?
This sort of irony that we have about the AFD being at once a very strong party and a very weak party is also somehow similar to the ways in which identities work. I think things like our racial identities, our ethnic identities, maybe our sexual orientation or something like that. Those are all very strong identities in the sense that they really stick to us, and that it matters to us when people say things about that kind of identity for us. And I think for a lot of people in Germany, it's been very hard in some sense to not have a way that you can think of being German as a good thing. A way of thinking of the culture as a positive in the world. And I think this is often the case that can result for a lot of people in a real attraction to people who say like, no, wait, it's okay to be German, or it's not even okay, it's great, it's wonderful. I want to be clear that there are a lot of German people I love, and part of what I love about them is the ways in which they're German. And I think that's it's obviously great to be whoever you are if the person you are is great. There's lots of potential for German greatness that's rooted in German cultural experience and historical identity. But at the same time, these identities are also always weak, right? Nobody wants to be nobody, even if you're completely proud of who you are, nobody's happy to be just their series of these, you are a black woman who is a lesbian, or you are a white man who's straight. That's not a satisfying identity for any of us, and it's not satisfying in the sense that, I would feel very sorry for anybody who really feels like some set of designations like that really describes who they are as a person. But it's also it's not really satisfying in the sense that it tells us what people need to live together. And I think that fundamentally a good identity, a really robust identity, is about the things that we like to do together. It's we could be two people, and maybe it only applies in a moment, but you and I could be two people who really both enjoy, I don't know, skateboarding, or eating a certain kind of noodle, right? And that can be an identity that in that moment is very weak because it goes away the second that we're not doing that thing together, but also very meaningful and very powerful and really bonds people. And I feel a politics that supports that kind of identity used to be more possible, used to be more open in Germany and elsewhere.
Peter, recently that if we study this political change carefully, it's not just about Germany. I want to bring US into our conversation for a moment. There's, again, according to the political scientists, there seems to be a new term. It's called patrimonialism. So in other words, put in a simple way, is the person who tends to run the country as a family business. So in other words, again, the person tends to picture itself or picture him or herself as the savior of the country, and in order to magnify the greatness, and in order to even to reduce the weakness, or even to shrink the weakness to the outsiders. But now coming back to AFD, of course, you mentioned Schultz as well. I want to dive into a little bit deeper. So how should we understand the word identities at this moment? I mean, again, you mentioned that you got friends, and we all have friends around the world, and of course, we ought to be proud of our own countries, and we ought to share the sense of pride when it comes to our country's history and also this political change or social changes. But from your perspective, based on this current political atmosphere, what does that mean to be a German today? And how do you think that the current political intricacy or the political atmosphere actually either strengthen the identity among the citizens or even start to challenge the citizens to reconsider the word identities? What do you think?
I mean, I think essentially that like identity becomes a super interesting and important topic in the moment when like we don't have very good opportunities to do things together. And I think that a huge part of the problem that has brought the AfD to power and that has brought, similar parties to power throughout the world is exactly the fact that we don't have access to the kinds of things that we do together that make questions of like ethnic origin or racial identity kind of secondary or uninteresting sometimes, right? Or at least have the power to give us an alternate way of understanding who we are. I grew up in America. It's obviously a place where like racial identities are hugely important and very, very hard to ignore in many cases, but it was also, very often the case that like the moments when they could seem less operative, when it could seem less important who somebody was racially, were very frequently, like school sports teams or bands, or, like the moment that people are like, that's our guitarist, or that's the running back. Other kinds of identities become less important, and those positions are just much more. It's much harder to go to war for the question of who's the guitarist than it is for the question of what a German is.
Peter, I want to talk about another critical issue. It's not just for the U.S. It's not just for countries in Southeast Asia, but actually it's critical for more countries in Europe. And again, particularly for Germany that you mentioned in the article, it's the word immigration. I mean, this is one of the critical matters standing at the crossroads. And you also wrote in the article that the current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, is willing to call for deportation, quote, on a grand scale on the cover of Die Spiegel, or the Green Party leader is happy to traffic in fear and xenophobia. But again, those are just words. However, how do you think that today, for this political change or for this political agenda, the AFD is handling the issue of immigrants? On one hand, that we understand this is a major issue top the agenda. But on the other hand, it's not a single easy task. So from your perspective, when it comes to real issue like immigrants or immigration, how should we understand this motivation or even this political motivation behind AFD? How should we understand that? Is this something that really to propel the voters to understand much better when we look at immigrants, or legally or illegally? Or you think this is something that is too much to handle, and Germany is time to have a conversation internally and also have the dialogues with the outside party as well? What do you think?
Look, I think that there are two questions, and it's really easy to conflate them. I think one question is, what's actually a good immigration policy? How many immigrants can Germany take at a certain time? At what rate can the country absorb them safely and provide them with the necessary resources that they need to live with dignity? What kinds of mechanisms does the country need in place to ensure that that they're integrated into the society in a way that is, productive and beneficial for everybody? And I don't consider myself an expert on those questions. I don't think that I have particularly deep insight into, how integration and immigration should work in modern German society. I do think that I have some expertise in the way that the rhetoric around immigration works. And when you look at most of when people talk about immigration now, like it's not, whether it's Schultz, you know, the kinds of discussions around immigration that we got post October 7th, especially, were very rarely sober calls for, moderate changes to Germany's immigration policies. They were very rarely sort of, disciplined investigations into potential problems with anti-Semitism coming from elsewhere and how that interacts with the German populace. They were mostly, what seemed to me to be based on fear, or to be provoking fear. They were, they painted with a very broad brush. They often countenanced a certain kind of brutality or, willingness to deport without, thinking about what consequences that might have for, for human rights, for German democracy, not to mention for the individuals being deported. And that to me is a thing where, regardless of the kinds of policies that people endorse individually. I think Habeck, for example, probably has, stated positions. Like if you read through his policy positions one by one, it probably wouldn't be so far off from things that I might be able to endorse. With that said, I think that the way that Habeck or the way that Schultz went after, immigrants or Muslims as a bloc is simply racist. It's simply offensive. It endorses a kind of brutality that I think is a remnant or is a legacy of the Nazi era. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that Habeck or Schultz are Nazis. I'm not saying that they're comparable with Nazis in the scope of their endorsement of that brutality. I'm not saying that, they're that in some kind of fundamental way. But I do think that the brutality of saying, we should start to, in großen Stil, right, in great style, we should deport in great style, like, that's to imply that there is something stylish that you can do about deportation, that you can, I don't know, that you should have like a special outfit that you put on and play the right music, right? Like it implies a kind of like not only a comfort with brutality, but a celebration of violence against some of the most vulnerable in the world that I do think at its core echoes, all of the other forms of brutality that we've seen in this world, from the Nazis, to American slaveholders, to choose your villain, you can take them straight out of a superhero movie. Like that's a kind of brutality that just, that seems like it's villainous to me. It's villainous and it's evil and you have to oppose it.
Peter, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's go back to the article. I mean, again, you mentioned that what happened on October the 7th, of course, as we mentioned before, we continue to see this international wars, right? Not only the one in Israel, between Israel and Hamas, and also we're looking at the war in Ukraine. Now, again, I mean, you are very modest when you share the answers regarding the Chancellor Olaf Scholz, but I still want to dance on this idea a little bit more. When we are looking at international crisis and when we're looking at international wars, again, by saying that make Germany great again, some can interpret it that which means domestic issues or domestic agenda, it's far more critical than offering support and help to international crisis. I mean, again, we're not underestimating what people are suffering overseas, but based on the political atmosphere, a lot of citizens in Germany today, they really care about what's happening domestically. So from your perspective, how should we evaluate the performance of Chancellor Olaf Scholz at this moment? Do you think that he's more leaning towards this building this global coalition, so it really elevate his image in a greater way, or you think it's more important to focus on the agenda for the party in order to build this bigger picture? Which one do you think is more important in this moment?
The most important thing is to reframe the terms of the in which politics are being discussed. And I think like the tendency that the AFD has, which they share, with the Republicans, which they share in America, which they share, I think, with a large number of populist parties throughout the world, is to do a kind of like really terrible political philosophy in place of actual politics. Like they're out there talking about like this idea, like make America great again, make Germany great again, resembles a lot of other kinds of political propaganda in that it doesn't actually mean anything, right? You know, like if you could understand, you know, these sayings to mean almost anything, and you know, I think that's somehow why they work so well as a slogan for you, or you know, for politics. But also why, you know, part of the thing that makes them so dangerous. And you know, I think Schultz or anybody else who has, you know, a piece of power in Germany today, would be very well served to just do things, you know, to get things done on a small level if necessary. But you know, to try to create a political culture that leaves the political philosophy to people who, you know, like me, just kind of want to sit in a room and read a bunch of books and talk all the time, and you know, don't want to base decisions about power on these sort of philosophical distinctions that aren't necessarily all that rigorous. You know, like particularly in the case of immigration, I feel like, you know, to some degree, like as a guy who really deeply loves theoretical conversations and discussions about the nature of right and wrong, it just seems like silly and almost immoral to me to have a lot of those conversations about immigration. You know, we know for a fact that Germany desperately needs particularly skilled immigrants, but just younger people. Like that's a very low level fact about German culture right now. You know, we know that distrust and, you know, resentment of immigration is much more common in areas where there's less immigration. That I think is a pretty much globally true phenomenon. You know, that when people actually live next to immigrants and actually experience what it means to live in a diverse society, they tend to embrace it. You know, this is a thing that we know. Like, you know, we know that the, you know, rates of criminality and, you know, these kinds of anxieties that we see about immigration, you know, may exist. There, of course, are, you know, communities that are, you know, have kinds of violence that may not be present in a certain society already. There are, you know, people who come from, you know, through traumatic experiences into a new place where they're unfamiliar, you know, may in some cases be violent. But at the same time, you know, it seems very hard to me to escape the conclusion that there's a very, very clear net benefit. And I think, you know, as soon as it's like jumping off a diving board, you know, like as soon as you do it, it's like, you know, like thinking about it's terrible, thinking about it's scary. As soon as you're actually doing it, it's just nice and kind of fun, you know? So I, you know, I don't know. I think to me, there are problems with German society that I really don't see, you know, how you can possibly resolve, like, without immigrants. Like, I don't see how you can find enough people to keep the pension system intact and to care for the aging society. You know, like the kids are going to grow up as fast as they are, and I don't think like a lot of German women are going to suddenly start to want to have 5 and 6 and 7 children. You know, it's like this is a society that needs immigrants. Demographically, and you know, in my opinion, it also desperately needs immigrants culturally. But you know, it's just, you know, I think as soon as, you know, like I want Germany to take the plunge and, like, you know, you know, people who've lived in diverse societies, whether, you know, Berlin or in the United States or elsewhere, you know that it's a benefit and it enriches you and it makes life so much more pleasant to have people from around the world around you who can share different cultures. And
well, Peter, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, the title is This is Germany, the last country anyone wants to make great again. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, there's no surprise that when we talk about this political complication in the U.S., and again, we don't really know who will be the next president, either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. But meanwhile, again, majority of the voters continue to believe that the best days are yet to come, especially for the U.S. And I believe the voters in Germany, they're thinking about the same thing. The best days are yet to come for Germany. I mean, again, politics is a very complicated game, and it's really hard and difficult to predict and understand what will come to all the voters. So I want to land the last question I want to ask, that in order to understand this current German political life, or the current German political atmosphere, as an outsider, as anyone who doesn't understand the complication within the political system, how should we understand the direction the country is heading? I mean, so in other words, is it about really the post-pandemic, this liberalism, or it's heading more towards conservatism, or it's really open for many different options? I want to hear your final thoughts.
I don't think that any country has, a real internal direction towards right-wing authoritarianism. I think that, to my mind, parties like the AFD, people like Trump, like they're kind of analogous to a virus that spreads. And right now we're seeing a global eruption of that virus. I think that there are certain parts of German culture that, make the country especially susceptible to some things. That's true probably of every culture. Every culture has its own way of somehow being susceptible to this kind of mania. But, at the end of the day, I don't know where the country's headed. I don't know, there's a lot that's terrifying about the world right now. There's a lot that's terrifying from Germany. And I think there's probably a lot that's terrifying from pretty much anywhere that people might be sitting. What I can say, though, with as much certainty as one can bring to a discussion of the future, I can say that, the AFD is weak. They're politically weak. Their leadership is weak. They're not particularly bright people. They're not people who are particularly, good at leadership. They don't have much experience with leadership. They don't have much experience with governance. I can say that they don't have good ideas for how to rule the country. In many cases, they don't have any ideas at all about how to rule the country. And I can say that when they have had a little bit of political power so far, it's gone very poorly. So, here as elsewhere, when people rule based on fears, when people vote based on fear and anxiety, the result is bad. The result is disastrous. And particularly at a moment where so much in the world is unsettled and so few countries seem to be, real bulwarks of democracy and of, decency and humanity. I think it's a terrifying thought to see a country give in to the kind of weakness that the AFD represents.
Well, again, Peter, we don't know what will happen to the country. And of course, we surely don't know this political path or this political destiny for Germany. But one thing we need to understand that dialogues like this and also the articles that you wrote really enlightens our viewers in an amazing way. And of course, because of the dialogues and the publications that really help us to ask better questions or even dig deeper in those political arena. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Peter Kuras. Again, Peter Kuras is a writer and a translator based in Berlin, and he has written about German politics and the culture for The Economist and The Guardians. Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes.
Thanks for having me, Will.
Thank you, Peter.